Joining me today is the former CEO of National Public Radio and the author of Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. Ken Stern, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me on the show.
You left the liberal bubble and have survived.
I did.
You're a survivor.
So, live on a 94% Democratic, in a 94% Democratic ward in Washington, D.C., 100% Democratic household. Increasingly concerned about this.
Does that mean they kicked you out of the house or
well,
outside of
it's still under debate.
Okay.
My 10-year-old son booed my first television appearance when the book came out. And I'm increasingly concerned about sort of the polarization, how much we hate the other side, often without really knowing the other side. So I decided I'd do something about it for myself. Recognizing I'm in a bubble like all of us are, I wanted to spend time as much as I could, trying to understand things from someone else's point of view. I spent a year traveling the country, communing with conservatives, with Republicans, really trying to see things from their point of view.
Yeah,
and I did survive.
So before we get, well, you've survived so far. Let's see how this hour goes.
Okay.
And there's a lot that I want to talk to you about because even the use of the word liberal in the subtitle I think is interesting because I always talk about the difference between the left and liberalism and a few other things. But first, let's just find out a little bit about your backstory. What were you doing that led you to be the CEO of NPR?
So I've spent a good part of my career in media, spent time in international broadcasting, Voice of America, and joined NPR in 1999, first as chief operating officer and then eventually became CEO and was there for about a decade. Have spent time in almost all the unpopular professions there are, law, politics, and media. So,
and you're from DC, so
right,
you've
so
really done the whole thing here.
Yeah, so there's a lot to dislike about my background apparently for most of the country.
Tell me a little bit about just the NPR machine. I know half my audience that leans right is probably hearing NPR and they're going, well, I like this guy because he left the bubble. But NPR like raises some flags for them, and then my audience on the left is going, NPR, they're the new Bible of truth and all that. Tell me a little bit about just the ecosystem of NPR.
So NPR is an interesting place. It is really a collective of public radio stations from around the country. So NPR is a company, which I ran for a number of years, of journalists and similar people. It's essentially a news organization, but it is connected to 500 public radio stations around the country. So it's unique in the sense that most of its reporters are located in Washington, D.C. and similar places, but you can go to virtually any community around the country. The wilds of Alaska, you'll find public radio stations, which I think makes it sort of a unique place.
Yeah. And do they have any other connection, the radio stations, other than that they fall under the NPR umbrella?
They're all part of the, not NPR, they're all part of the public radio system. And the thing that often people key on is that they are, not through NPR, through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the recipients of various federal funds to support their operations.
Yeah. What does it say that if we were to look at all of these radio stations, that I would guess that probably every single one of them leans left, yet they're funded by the government. So this isn't a nonpartisan radio operation, really, right?
Yeah, so I've made myself somewhat unpopular in public radio over the last few months by saying two things, which I think you can hold in your head at the same time. I actually have a lot of admiration for virtually all the reporters I know at NPR and public radio stations. They try to tell stories from both sides. They're dedicated to the craft of journalism. Sometimes I think they are often even too almost metronome-like, and here's one point of view and here's another. And so I think it is appropriate to acknowledge that they are serious journalism, doing journalists trying to be balanced and fair, to appropriate a slogan from Fox.
Right.
I think the challenge that I raised with them, which made me unpopular, is they all probably, not all of them, many of them come from the same, these are self-perpetuating organizations. They hire people who are like them, who tend to think like them, who came from similar backgrounds, Many of them, I think if you took a census of them, you'd find very few voted for Donald Trump.
Right. It's funny, I can see how careful you're trying to be with your words, that you don't want to say all, and of course you don't mean every employee there, but probably the vast, vast majority, if not 90% or more, are progressives, I think is basically what you're trying to say,
I think that's probably right. And so, I think the challenge is not that they're progressives, but there is a consequence of groupthink about what stories are important, what policies are right and wrong, what voices should be on the air, and I think that's a real challenge for a place like NPR, and really for mainstream media as a whole. It's what I said to the folks at NPR was, they would never think of covering racial issues only with white males, no matter how good those white males are, and really it should be the same with politics. They shouldn't cover it only with people who largely come from a progressive background, no matter how dedicated the craft of journalism they are.
What kind of racial issue do you mean?
Well, it doesn't matter. I just mean any sort of, if they wanted to cover, if they had a beat on race in America,
right?
They would not only have, wouldn't have whites on it, white males only on it. And they shouldn't. They shouldn't cover gender issues only with men. I think you need to have people of different backgrounds and different ideas to have the right type of creative tension that a newsroom needs.
Right. You're not saying exclude those people. You're saying they just have.
No,
to
of course not.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I'm all for white males. I happen to be one.
Right.
Last I checked. It's that you need to have not only diversity of gender and race in newsroom, you have to diversity of ideas and backgrounds.
Yeah. So where were your politics? So you started there in '99. Were you a hardcore lefty? Were you a centrist? A liberal? Or
I don't think a hardcore person would write the book I did and take the experience, but I spent time in Democratic politics on the re-elect for Bill Clinton. I think I say in the book, I voted straight Democratic ticket, except for I think I probably voted against Marion Barry in his various quests to be mayor for life, and that's about it.
Yeah. So the crack arrest was too much for you. That's where you drew the line with Marion Barry.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. So when did you sort of start realizing that there was this ideological lockdown on alternative opinions there?
You mean so I think there's an alternative lockdown on ideas generally.
Yeah.
Let's not make this about NPR or one place, because I think that's unfair, because what has happened in this country is we've all become in our own bubbles, liberals, conservatives, and it's a product of a number of different things that's going on. It's really quite extraordinary. It's we now choose where we live based upon political ideology and try to find homogeneous neighborhoods, politically homogeneous neighborhoods. It didn't exist before. Our political parties are increasingly political homogeneous. There are no such thing as conservative Democrats or liberal Republicans anymore. They don't have homes.
Yeah, where'd the Blue Dog Democrats go?
Those
are the guys that I would love to be voting for.
Right, they died. The Blue Dog Caucus was quite important 15 years ago. Yeah. And it doesn't exist anymore. There is no Democrat who is more conservative than the most liberal Republican, and vice versa. The Venn diagram does not meet anymore in the Congress. And now we have all of our own media, right? So conservatives can listen to Fox or any other, or Rush or any other place. Democrats liberals and progressives have plenty of choices that fit their own. And it's incredibly destructive. And it means we're all increasingly in our own bubble. And when that happens, it's not that we actually begin to disagree more. It becomes easy to demonize the other side. When you don't know them, when you don't hear from them, when you don't dialogue with them, it's really easy to hate each other. And that's what's happened in this country. We really hate the other side in ways that are very different than 15 years ago.
Well, I think that's why I do the show and why you wrote this book.
Yeah.
But before we get out of the radio part of it, you mentioned Rush. Why does it seem that right-wing radio, so Rush and Glenn Beck and Michael Savage and the list goes on, seems to be commercially viable, gets tons of listens and all that, and left-wing radio, it simply doesn't work outside of what's funded really by the government. So Air America was a catastrophe,
right.
For example.
I don't have a good answer to that, so let me admit up front, I don't think it's a good answer. I'll tell you what conservatives will say. They will say, I don't think this is either, I think it's a little bit of truth and a little bit of falsehood in it, is what liberals find a home at places like the New York Times and NPR. They're comfortable with them. Their needs are met. And they'll say that Rush and others are successful because conservatives' needs are not met in mainstream media. And that's, look, I'm not going to make an equivalency between left and right. I think that's a false equivalency in terms of media and how they operate. But it is clearly true when you look at the the psychographics of the readers of the New York Times or the listeners of NPR, they come primarily from the left.
Yeah, when you hear people on the right, it's usually people on the right say, well, why are we funding NPR? I mean, why is the government even funding public radio at all at this point, and especially if there is an ideological bent to it? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, again, I don't want to, let's not take this too far, because ideological bent is right in sort of an unconscious way, subconscious way. It doesn't have, I think, no one sits at NPR or the New York, at least didn't used to, and says, let's tell one side of the story and not the other.
Yeah, I suspect that's actually not quite true. I mean, I think they're in their bubble, as you talk about here, so much that I don't know that they're consciously doing it, but they've sort of decided what the truth is.
I think it's a fair criticism, right? But there's a difference. I mean, there's a very significant difference in how mainstream media works and conservative media works. And let's just acknowledge it without sort of attributing anything good or bad to it, and just acknowledge that they come from a different place and a different sort of journalistic ethic. Public fraud funding for public broadcasting is an artifact of a different era. They started in 1970. When there was 3 networks and there were just no real alternatives to those 3 networks and a handful of newspapers. And it was really important that the government, as they do in England and a lot of other places, supported the public radio and public television to make it exist. Probably true that if public radio and public television didn't exist, no one would create it now because there's so many different outlets. The reason is, I think it's interesting though to actually explore the reason why public broadcasting funding still exists. It's not because of NPR and PBS, it's because of the local stations. The people who, they'll bang on NPR and PBS, but at least in my day, the people who actually stood up for public broadcasting when it came to appropriation time was Ted Stevens, as conservative a senator you ever get from Alaska, because he didn't really care for NPR or PBS particularly, but he loved Alaska public broadcasting. And he knew that that was actually a lifeline service to parts of Alaska that didn't get content, local news and others. And that's why I think it still gets public support, not because of a like or dislike for the national content providers.
That's interesting. I don't know too much about Ted Stevens specifically, but I wonder, was he fighting, would he have been okay with, well, let's the state fund it then, not instead of the federal government? Or is this all funded? I assume is a partnership partly with the states?
Yeah, so states have put up. So public broadcasting is complicated, but states.
We don't have to go too into the weeds. But I do think it's interesting relative to role of government.
Yeah, so many, not all, many public broadcasting stations get significant support from local jurisdictions, whether it's a state or a municipality.
Yeah. So even though he probably wasn't thrilled with what they were putting on air, he just wanted some of the federal funds that help allow it, because he liked it for his state's purposes.
Yeah, he knew it was a lifeline service to Alaska and Wyoming and other places like that that don't have major media markets. That's really who, and that's where the money goes, is to those stations.
Right. It's interesting because the world has changed so much, obviously, since 1970. Right. And the idea that the government, I mean, to me, and I get it, Sesame Street's great, and I was just watching it with my niece a couple weeks ago, but the idea that the government is funding any of these ways that we get media now seems very archaic to where we are in 2017.
It is. The interesting thing to think about, and I mean, we could spend the whole hour talking about it, and I hope we don't, because I want to talk about my book.
We'll get there.
But if federal funding went away tomorrow, on the radio side, I know much more about radio than television, NPR would ultimately be fine. Many of the stations in big cities would be fine. It's actually the rural stations that would collapse. And that's why I think there is that support for public broadcasting funding as it goes forward.
Yeah. Just generally speaking, do you think that if funding was slowed down or cut or whatever, that wouldn't private people that feel that this is important jump in on that? I mean, that's one of the themes that I talk about here a lot, about how much should the government do, and if the government stopped doing so much, maybe if these things are vital and important, that private people would
they do.
Take on some of the burden.
Yeah, public radio, I think, principal support. I'm 10 years out of date, so at least when I was there, the principal revenue came from listeners like you. That's where the largest source of revenue comes from. So,
I was the host of a PBS fundraiser in New York City, in Manhattan, many years ago. I gave away some totes and all that, did it for free.
So again, I think in New York, WNYC would be fine. They'd probably hate me for saying this, but I don't know that Alaska Public Radio would be fine, because the amount of people to give them money, pretty low. I mean, just
Yeah.
the number of people and the wealth available to tap is very different there.
Yeah, it's just an interesting dilemma because I could see some valuable stations in these local markets, these small markets, that there's worth to them. And then on the other hand, it's like, why should we be funding all of these things if they can't just exist on their own? It's just an interesting philosophical.
It's interesting, and it's actually a good segue because it's one of those issues which I think if conservatives talk to conservatives about and liberals talk to liberals about, they'd come to very different points of view.
Yeah.
If you actually talk to people who know and put people together, you actually realize it's actually a fairly complicated, nuanced issue that has no sort of obvious right or wrong answer.
Yeah.
That's actually true when you go out and talk to people about issues. People actually, in social media, they're angry and mad, but in real life, they're actually pretty moderate. And that's one of the things I discovered in my year traveling the country.
Yeah, well, people are always their seemingly worst online and snappiest, and very rarely do that, when you're standing across somebody or sitting across somebody just like this. So let's talk about the word liberal for a second, because the subtitle is How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right.
Yeah.
What does liberal mean to you?
So I think that's a catch-all phrase for progressive, Democrat. I mean, I think I'm using that in some type of gross way to describe Democrats, progressive, people of the left. I don't mean necessarily classical liberal as you might be thinking of it. As it meant, because I think today it means it's a catch-all for the left portion of the spectrum.
Yeah, it's unfortunate for me because I've tried really hard to show people that if you're a classical liberal and you believe in the individual and live and let live, that actually that has virtually nothing to do with progressives. But even some of my allies now who are on the right always say liberal, 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 and I'm like, guys, let's separate liberal from left. But
I don't know if I gave it that careful thought in terms of the term. I mean, I think it's a catch-all for the people whose environment I was shared. People I lived with, the people I worked with, the people who ran the media organizations that I used.
Did you find those people to actually be liberal, though? I know this is a little bit about the definition of the words, but did you find that they really, at their heart, were liberal? I mean, that they really were tolerant and understanding, and liberalism in its best sense?
Well, good God, no. And I think
I think this gets us to where the book is.
And I think the thing that's worried me, I'll say two things, one of which is I think that's shared. We're increasingly intolerant of anyone who disagrees with us. It's extraordinarily so. And it has angered me a little bit, sort of wounded me personally, because I've always thought of, like you, thought of liberals, one of the tenets of modern liberalism is tolerance of different perspectives and belief that really we need a diversity of ideas. And there is value in different ideas and value in listening and engaging. That is not a value of modern American politics as we know it. And that sort of wounds me personally, and one of the things that led me to this book.
Yeah. Do you remember a moment when you started seeing that more amongst your kind, so to speak?
So I'll tell you a story. No, not particularly. I mean, I think there are lots of instances, but I'll tell you a story that's got me going on the book. Which is a story of my neighborhood in Washington, D.C. I live in this nice neighborhood called Mount Pleasant, 94% Democratic ward. The Green Party candidate outpolled Donald Trump in the last election. It's a nice, diverse neighborhood. We value our diversity, but we don't, and it's always been obvious, we make jokes about it. We never really valued political diversity, obviously so. But it really hit home to me on something called the Hobart Street Pledge. That's the name of the street I live in. It's got a lot of team spirit on Hobart Street. We have lots of block parties. We close the street on Halloween. And our biggest block party is called Porch Fest. And it has a parade, and every year it starts with the Hobart Street Pledge. And I always love the idea of the Hobart Street Pledge, because the kids sort of pledge allegiance to Hobart Street Northwest.
Right.
And change every year. And one year it went, I pledge allegiance to Hobart Street Northwest, yada, yada, yada. Everyone is welcome on Hobart Street, white or black, gay or straight, man or woman. Everyone but Republicans. And it was a joke, but it wasn't a joke. And I wrote a mediocre article for The Atlantic about it, but it really got me thinking about how have we come to a place where we can value diversity but not viewpoint diversity. And that's, I think, where we are as a country. And let's say, you know what, I'm not all that different. I have the same sort of prejudice against the other side. Let me test that in some interesting ways.
So how did you start testing that?
So, so that's a challenge. Like, okay, how do you actually see things from the other point of view? So over a course of a year, I did sort of tons of different things. I went to Trump rallies and spent Tea Party meetings and went pig hunting in Texas. Spent more time than the rest of my life combined in church, mostly evangelical churches. I got adopted by a Assembly of God congregation in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I went to, spent time in working class bars in Youngstown, Ohio, and went to coal mining country. I went on a tour. I thought of all the places I thought I should hate, like Liberty University and, on hunting trips and gun shows in Texas. And really found out I didn't hate them. And they didn't hate me. And that actually, we disagreed on a lot of things with the people I met. But 8 things out of 10 we probably saw eye to eye on when we were actually talking. And that was a real lesson. We're actually surprisingly moderate people. You just wouldn't know it from the media environment that we all live in.
So what's it like to show up in these places? How'd you do it? Did you just walk into a church and go, guys, I'm here to make sure I don't hate you. What's going on here?
I did. That's exactly what I did. I had a couple interesting experiences. I went to a evangelical jamboree for evangelical youth, 15,000 of them, called Urbana, in a football stadium in St. Louis. I managed to get an invitation to that and spent 2 days listening to kids talk about the issues that I want to talk to them about, abortion and gay rights, but they want to talk about Black Lives Matter. They want to talk about refugees, how to help them, not how to keep them out. And it's a little bit of a preconception destroying experience. And then I went to churches. So I emailed Pastor Steve. So I'll actually tell you how I ended up with Pastor Steve. So I had a rabbi. That's maybe not the right term when you talk about evangelicals, in the evangelical community guy, a professor at Washington University Law School named John Inazu. And he said, I told him, I went to one of the big evangelical mega churches, and I sort of proudly told him about it. He said, well, that's great, but you need to go to an you need to go to an Assembly of God church, with 50 members to really see the real heart of evangelicalism. I'm like, where the hell am I going to find that? I live in Washington, D.C. And I Googled evangelical churches in Washington, D.C., somewhat, in sort of desperation. It turned out there were like 100 congregations within 50 miles. And I had no idea about it. So I randomly picked one, had a service time that appealed to me, and emailed Pastor Steve and said, I'd write a book, I'd like to come. He was a little hesitant, but he opens his door to everyone, and I probably went down there half a dozen times in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And it's interesting, Pastor Steve and I actually have almost the same sort of biography in some ways. We were the same age, we were born in the same area, had very different paths in life, but we actually both have a wife and one son who happens to be the same age. We had a lot in common, very different thoughts on life and what's important, but a lot in common, When I think of Pastor Steve, I think of someone who I really admire, and when people betray everyone on the right as deplorables, I think of Pastor Steve and a lot of other people I met, and I know that description is just flat wrong.
Yeah. So you go to the churches now. Were you just sort of watching from the back, or did you actually beyond the pastor? I mean, did you start interviewing people? Did they know you were writing a book?
Yeah. They were kind enough to actually put together focus groups. So like the second time I went, Pastor Steve put together like 10 members of the congregation. And I just sort of sat in their lunchroom in the basement, and we talked for an hour about politics and community and things like that. People were actually extraordinarily welcoming. That's one of the other things. They wanted to talk. They feel, a lot of the people want to talk about media, just like you did, because they feel locked out. I wasn't there talking about media, I was there to listen, but they feel locked out from the national media and that frustration. I was a good person to express that frustration to.
Yeah. Were you shocked that they were as welcoming and friendly? It almost sounds silly to have to ask that question, but I think a lot of lefties, a lot of progressives actually think that these are all evil people. Did it shock you?
So let me tell you a story. So the Washington Post did a word cloud, so I think about a year or two ago, which they asked Democrats what you thought about Republicans and Republicans what you thought about Democrats. And then they sort of put it up visually. And all the words on both sides were terribly nasty. And Democrats thought Republicans were bigoted, cheap, selfish, racist. And that was 2 years ago. I'm sure it's much worse now, right?
Those are the
nice
good
words
old days. Yeah.
So I sort of challenged myself, like, I didn't believe that, but I sort of believed it.
Yeah. What were the words, though, that Democrats said about Republicans? Do you remember?
Those were the racist.
I'm sorry, the other way around. That Republicans said about Democrats.
I don't remember, but they were all unflattering. I think stupid, intolerant.
Libtard was probably.
Yeah, right. Snowflake. It was all before that, right?
Okay.
Before that whole lingo. I learned that lingo from Breitbart.
Yeah.
So I had to admit myself that somewhere, deep down, I probably had those, let's call them prejudice, because they're not accurate. And I sort of carried me with them even as I was trying to be open-minded and open-hearted in the journey. So, it didn't shock me that people were people, and they cared about the same things I care about and wanted to talk. But, I also know that it was preconception busting, if I have to be perfectly honest about it.
Yeah. So give me another anecdote or two of wandering around, things that sort of hit you that became sort of the seminal moments in this.
Yeah, so I wanted, again, sort of the challenge of what do you do to sort of be in the shoes of a conservative? It's not like, you can watch Fox and you can read Breitbart and do a lot of different things, but how do you experience it? So, NASCAR races. But one thing is, so I read an article in the Washington Post. Apparently, I still read the Washington Post, and it had a quote from the head of Heritage Foundation Action, who said, the people in the Acela corridor are missing the awesomeness of America. I said, that's right, that's me. I'm in the Acela corridor. I need to find the awesomeness of America. So I knew Tucker Carlson a little bit, and I went to see Tucker, who I know well, and I said, all right, tell me how to find the awesomeness of America. You should know, even though he's from the same Acela corridor I am. And he said, sort of puzzling, then he started, you should go pig hunting in Texas. I said, all right, I'll go pig hunting in Texas. So I did that as part of my challenge. I want to challenge myself on an issue that I didn't know a lot about, but I was sure I was right. On gun control and gun rights.
So what was your position at that time when we started here?
I'm for virtually every form of gun control imaginable, up to if I could figure out a way to take everyone's guns, I would probably have been for it.
That was your previous position?
That was the previous position.
All right, now we'll get to your. So then you have this experience.
So I went hunting. So I went pig hunting in Texas and learned out. Some people should have a gun and some shouldn't, and I'm on the shouldn't side because I'm more dangerous. But it's in the morning.
Was it your first time actually holding a gun?
My first time holding and shooting a gun. I went to a skeet range in Prince George's County the week before to test it, but essentially that experience was the first time. In the morning, I ended up with a 3-generation family from Georgia. Isaac, CJ, and Paps, the grandfather. And I ended up actually with Isaac, who was at the time 8. It was sort of my hunting companion. And so it was sort of, he was the mentor in that because he knew how to hunt and he was sort of gently guided me through the hunting process. And we had a great time together and we told stories of hunting even though I didn't have stories of hunting and he wanted to tell how he shot the shit out of pigs the previous day. In the afternoon I ended up with what I call sort of a demographic version of a bar joke, a black guy from Houston, a Hispanic former soldier, and a Serbian immigrant, and me, a Jew from Washington. We were the hunting group. Yeah. And we had a great time. We talked about guns and their community and why they cared about guns, and it's a great experience. And I also called up John Lott, the conservative economist, and said, all right, convince me why I'm so wrong. And he did. I mean, when you talk to real experts and you talk to real people and real experts, you better be open to learning a little bit. And I did learn a lot. Yeah.
All right, let's pause on economics for a second. It's so funny as you're describing this. I mean, basically you're writing the plot when you do the screenplay on this to City Slickers 3. I mean, you're Billy Crystal, and he has to go pig hunting this time instead of wrestling.
Bronco busting, right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So you have these experiences. You seem to like the people. Did you find any diversity of thought on that side? I mean, it sounds like it was mostly at first about, well, they were nice, so that's pretty good. Yeah. Did you see, were they all in lockstep intellectually, the way you were sort of frustrated with that on the left?
So I think people lived a conservative bubble too, and tend to gravitate towards each other. But the truth of the matter is, I mean, the truth of the matter is, most people don't actually spend a lot of time thinking about these issues. I mean, the media is saturated, my hometown, the swamp of Washington is saturated. 90% of the country is not spending their time worried about the details of the tax bill or whether Jerusalem should be the location for the American embassy in Israel or not. They're worried about the community, they're worried about family, they're worried about the Youngstown State football team more than they are worried about that. And part of the sort of, I think, the fallacy of modern media and political insider is that the belief that everyone cares about the same things we do. They don't. They're really cared about their local issues and their family matters, and that's really what they want to talk about. And the charge, like I hear from a lot of my liberal friends or progressive friends, that everyone who voted for Trump is either agrees with Trump or is a racist like Trump or whatever. It's not true. I mean, people just don't pay attention on the same levels that I do, that you do, and others. And I think a lot of the conversations showed diversity of thought because most people don't actually spend a lot of time thinking about it. When you actually talk about, are you for gun, people don't fall neatly into, are you for guns or are you against guns? They actually tend to gravitate towards the middle when you actually start talking about, is this a reasonable gun control idea? Is this do you really want to confiscate guns? People gravitate towards the middle in real life, just not in the media world.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about your evolution then. So as someone that was pretty radical in a certain sense on guns beforehand, I mean, you were saying almost get rid of them.
Yeah.
Now you go out, you're hunting pigs in Texas with an 8-year-old.
Yeah.
Then what happens?
So eventually I came to the conclusion, so I came not an acolyte of John Lott, because that's not correct. I criticize some of his work in my book. But I was persuaded by sort of the effectiveness. So John Lott he's not a gun rights guy, he's a public safety guy. And the challenge he put to me was, explain to me how so many of these gun control measures that you believe are fantastic actually would change things. And as I dived with him and then separately into the data and understood that, how these things actually work, it actually taught me two things. One is that most of the things that people stand up for on gun control don't actually work.
Meaning the laws themselves don't.
Or the proposals for further restrictions on gun use generally won't have any impact. And secondly, I think even more importantly, people have forgotten that the murder rate with using guns in this country has fallen half over the last 20 years. As we've been arguing over here about gun control or gun rights, we've actually been extraordinarily effective in terms of driving down gun homicides in this country. And it has nothing to do with that debate. It has to do with better policing, economic opportunity, attacks on drug gangs and things like that. And there's actually a lot of learning. And if we really cared about the ultimate outcome, we'd spend a lot more time figuring out how to do things like Boston did on the pulling levers program, and less about this argument about whether, wait a minute, do you need an assault weapon ban? Because that actually has relatively little effect, if any.
Yeah. So when people are talking about guns, to me, this is one of the ones where we've really cordoned ourselves off. We're almost at the place of ban or everyone gets a bazooka. I definitely fall more on the side of, I strongly believe in the Second Amendment, and I don't think that the murders that we have necessarily are gun issues. I mean, even the guy, to your point about the laws, the guy last month that shot the church in Texas, it was illegal for him to get a gun.
Right.
So there were laws in place. So it's like, we can keep making more laws, but that doesn't mean people won't keep breaking the laws. And that seems to be the disconnect, I think, where the left says, well, just make more laws and we can actually whittle away at all of this. And for me, it's like, I don't see how more laws actually resolve this.
These other things actually complicated. So the Sutherland Spring church slaying, as you described, was evocative to me because where I went pig hunting was about 8 miles from Gonzales, Texas. As the crow flies, about 30 miles and 30 minutes by car. And that's actually one of the things is, you don't have a cop around the corner, a beat cop around the corner like you do in Washington, D.C. Reminds me of the T-shirt I saw at gun shows, which is, I'd rather have a gun in my hand than a cop on the phone. But it's evocative because it has so much. It sort of bottles up so much of the challenge, which is we clearly have a problem. Look, we have a mass shooting, and more importantly, we have urban shootings every day. And we, even though we've had successes, we still are we have far more violent society than other similar situated countries, say in Western Europe.
Yeah. For people that want to know a little more about that, just Google how many people were shot in Chicago this past weekend.
Yes.
They keep a running tally, and it's insane.
And that has nothing to do with assault weapons or registration laws, because it's almost all handguns and almost all guns obtained illegally. We have so we have a problem. So let's all acknowledge that there's a really horrible public policy problem, but nothing that we talk about actually would solve it. And in Sutherland Springs, you have a guy who got his gun, shouldn't have got his gun, and then he was ultimately corralled by a private citizen who lawfully had a gun and probably potentially stopped worse killings. Mm-hmm. So it's a complicated issue, and I think because we're all in our own bubbles talking to each other, we miss the nuance and don't really try to solve the problem because it's solvable. We've actually solved it in some ways.